Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about the news for the week, which is the fact that there have been massive layoffs in the journalism sector, and many people are seeing this as a almost monumental victory where things will now get back to normal. But I'm here as usual as the wet blanket to let everyone know that they should not rejoice prematurely. And of course, as usual, I am thinking about this and talking about this not because it is the news, but because I want to talk about reinstituting the ideas of true heroism. And speaking of true heroism, just to let everyone know, there are two links in the description and on the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. There are 2 superhero graphic novels and 1 sword and sorcery low fantasy. They center themselves around ideas of death and honor in order to explore that traditional idea of a hero in a traditional way that you make a story, giving my audience what they want with excitement, adventure, and fun, not to mention some spectacular art, which you're looking at in the background. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. All right, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the fact that there have been major layoffs in many news organizations across the country over the last week. These have drastically affected everyone from your lowly leftist clickbait, quote unquote, journalism to major publications like the Los Angeles Times. Some people even saying, well, journalists even saying that this is the death of journalism. That's how many people are getting laid off right now. But it's not really the death of journalism, it's the death of bad journalism. Because the people getting fired are the people typically who have been hired because of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, this can be for many reasons. Most of the people are saying it's only those people being fired because they were the last people hired. And when you fire people based on seniority systems, that's the way it goes. Because, well, background to this, after the riots of the Summer of Love, there was an increase in hiring according to diversity, equity, and inclusion of over 230%. So yeah, I could see it being not the fact that these places want to get rid of these people because they're destroying the company, because they're not actually producing anything that can be sold, anything that can produce money, because all they're doing is screwing up the works with diversity, equity, and inclusion. But at the same time, I can understand that maybe it's just because these people were the last people in, therefore they're the first people out. According to a seniority system, that's how it works. Now, the thing is that these people who are hired according to diversity, equity, and inclusion are moaning and wailing, saying that no, you can't hire and fire upon that kind of system anymore. Therefore, you need to keep us and just fire other people because you're doing detrimental things to the diversity, equity, and inclusion system. And how mentally divergent are these people to think in that way? Well, let me just flash you up something in the background and you can stop and read it at your leisure. But it's basically the people who were laid off from the Los Angeles Times saying that no, you can't fire us because then you're firing a whole lot of Black, Latino, and journalists of color. That's literally what they say. Oh, I forgot to mention the Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern, North African, and South African peoples that they also say, those are people of color. You can't fire those people. Why? Because you're decimating what they call the caucuses of these people. But anyway, it's just bizarre to see these people who are supposedly journalists acting like children saying, no, you can't do that to us. But let's get down to the point. And the point is that many people are looking at this and saying, yes, this is definitely a move in the right direction. And I agree with that point. But they're taking it too far and saying this is showing that we're actually starting to right the ship. And I'm looking at it going, no, don't take that from it at all. And why? Well, I'll explain to you why. First off, why is because when I went online to look through social media posts talking about these layoffs, I learned that there are additional layoffs happening at different places along with these journalists getting laid off. I wanted to look into the journalism aspect of it because, well, it's print media and I look a lot at comics, which is another form of print media and is a distant cousin of journalism because they both used to be attached to newspapers in some way through the printing methods or the paper available, etc., etc. And that is important, and I will come back to that eventually. But the point is that these other layoffs that I heard about while going through this information are much more in line with what I usually talk about, which is entertainment rather than journalism. Broadly, there has been some major reorganization going on over at Disney. Bob Iger himself has talked about this, about how they're going to downsize and restructure. And some of these layoffs are going to affect bigger parts of their company, like Pixar. Their animation and number of animators, all that kind of stuff, people who work on the Pixar movies, is going to be reduced. So there's going to be layoffs there. But let's look at layoffs that have already occurred. Staying with Disney for a second, Disney has, over the last week, laid off at the very least 115 employees from their shop, Disney shops. And if we look at other parts of the entertainment sector, we can see that there has been layoffs at Hasbro, and at least 1,900 people have been laid off at Activision Blizzard and Xbox. And of course, I should mention that all of this comes on the heels of massive layoffs within tech companies just last year, 2023. Now, here's why I would say take this all with a grain of salt, because you're looking at these layoffs and going, yeah, they're moving in the right direction, but how much is this going to affect the companies? Well, here's what I found out first of all, when, again, pouring through social media to try to find out what is going on within the lives of the people who are being laid off. Well, here's the thing. Most of them are saying, well, first of all, I found it extremely funny that I only found one person who actually, I think, could stand on his own feet and say, well, I've taken this experience and now I'm going to make my own job with it. Kudos to that guy. Most other people were looking at this and saying, I have been devastated. I no longer have my parent/employer to take care of me anymore. I need a new job. And here's the thing. They are saying this and they're getting reactions from people who still work within the entertainment sector who are saying, yeah, you see, all of these people who need work, if you're still working for one of these entertainment companies and you have a position available, give it to them. Quite literally, I saw a post from a person who works for one of the companies who does the video game extensions for the Marvel games. I'm not entirely sure how that works out, but anyway. And they're saying, yes, I have some openings coming up within my departments that I am dealing with. I am going to hire on people who have been fired from these other companies. So I saw several posts like that, and also other posts where you have these people saying, can you please signal boost the fact that I need a job? And these people who are being laid off, or the people who still work in the sector, are doing exactly that. They're signal boosting the fact that these other people need jobs so that they can then get them back into the entertainment working system. Now, of course, these layoffs are coming because people aren't making money. So no, not everyone who is getting laid off is going to be hired back, but they're going to take those people who have been laid off. And again, people who have been laid off because they're not making any money, because they are part of this diversity, equity, and inclusion push that happened 3 years ago. And they're saying, we're going to bring you right back into the system any way we can. And my own personal interpretation of this is the fact that since there are many people who have been fired, but few people who are going to be fired back, the people who are actually going to get the jobs and be rehired are the pure ideologues, the people who are neck deep within diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, is this just me projecting and noticing things which might not be there within social media posts today? Well, no, I've been covering this thing for the last 5 to 6 years. So let's go over a few of the reasons why this is happening according to what I have dug up over the last 6 years and done videos on, which each of those videos has references to those podcasts from Marvel or their hiring practices or things that I dug up at the points where I was looking at those things separately and individually. All right, so let's start here. The place where I used to get a lot of my information from was a podcast from Marvel called The Women of Marvel. What was it? Well, it was the personal podcast, basically, of the second in command at Marvel Comics, who was Sana Amanat. She was hired as what we would now call a diversity, equity, and inclusion taskmaster, someone who was, according to her own words, hired even though she didn't have the qualifications to work there, but she was hired to specifically, again, according to her words, restructure the entire way that comics were made and the fan base for comics itself, that is to say, Marvel Comics. So again, she put together this podcast, and since she was tapped on the shoulder and hired by Marvel, in a way where they said, why don't you come and work for us? This would be a great diversity, equity, and inclusion move. This is exactly what she was doing when she was hiring and firing people for Marvel Comics. And her personal podcast, which was The Women of Marvel, was centered very much around these kinds of ideas. The podcast would do entire years worth of programming upon one theme a year, and those themes would center around how do you get diverse people hired into making and controlling the comic industry. And really, it's not a big leap. She was specifically hired, again, according to her words, to restructure the entire way that comics were made and the entire fan base. Of course, she's going to restructure the way that people were hired and fired and bring in more diversity, equity, and inclusion to change completely everything from how they were shipped out to the kinds of stories that were there. And she became eventually fast-tracked as the vice president of content and character development. But back to the podcast. The podcast, again, these years worth of themes were about things like mentorship. Another year, they focused on building allies within the industry. All of these were various studies on the theme of how do you first get hired by Marvel and how do you stay there and control the industry. And, oh, by the way, whenever they did a Women of Marvel panel at the Comic-Cons, and the major Comic-Cons always had one, at the end, the second half of all of those panels were, how do you get hired in the comic industry? And the answer to that question is nepotism. What they were talking about with mentorship and gaining allies is you need to build up these systems of connections so nepotism works in your favor. One of the podcasts, they even talked about, actually it was more than one, it was a couple, where they talked about how men were meant to hold open the door for women so that they could come in and take over their jobs and then in turn, quite literally, get rid of them. And really, when I talk about nepotism that they're trying to set up, this should not be a shock. Because if you look at the entire quote-unquote progressive system and how they work, they're not trying to overthrow the things that they label as evil. They're just trying to turn the tables. Like the ideas of Ibram X. Kendi, who, by the way, has many disciples working in the entertainment system. But he says, no, we can't get rid of racism. You need to be anti-racist instead. Well, what does that mean? Well, as he famously quotes in his New York Times bestseller book, the way to deal with past discrimination is present discrimination. And the way to deal with present discrimination is future discrimination. So he's not trying to get rid of discrimination. He's trying to say those people who were the discriminators in the past or now need to become the discriminated against in the now or the future. And so it is vice versa with the people who have been discriminated against. They don't need to give up on discrimination. They just need to become now the people with power and then discriminate themselves. That's what his entire idea of anti-racism is about. It's flipping the tables so that everyone is in the reverse position. And this is exactly what the nepotism within the entertainment systems were doing. Within the podcast that I'm talking about and many others that were connected to Marvel, they talked about over and over again how, and this was not actually real, but this is what they were claiming. They were claiming that comics had always been an old boy system, and so they needed to get rid of that old boy system. But how would they get rid of it? Well, they would get rid of it by instituting a new old boy system where they're on top. More of a femboy system now. Why? Because it's made up of feminist women and feminized men. They're the ones in control now. They're the ones who use the nepotism to get the people they like hired. And again, to show you that I'm not pulling this out of my hat, let me go into some specifics. Now, there were two people that I can think of just off the top of my head who did the following. The first one was Kelly Sue DeConnick. She was the person who was leading the charge in these podcasts to say it was an old boy system and we need to get rid of it. Both her and this other fellow who wrote a Silver Surfer miniseries for Marvel, I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, called Gaslight, where they had this new character called Gaslight, who was basically a black character who was taking over the story of Silver Surfer, or tried to anyways. Both of these people, one of them, Kelly Sue DeConnick, working for feminism because she declares herself an intersectional feminist over and over again, and the other one, this author of Silver Surfer Gaslight, who is very much setting up entire Comic Cons based upon races of people. He was literally the driving force behind setting up what he called a BIPOC Comic Con, that is to say, a Comic Con only for people of color, which is to say, not for white people. So one of them working on the feminist tack, the other one working on the racial tack. Both of them stated within Podcast for Marvel that they had a list of people that you could hire if you're looking to hire, on the one hand, females or people who identify as feminine, or on the other hand, people of color. So they weren't making black lists. What they were doing was making white lists. And these white lists would be lists of people who had been vetted as very, very quote unquote progressive. And if you needed to hire someone, come and consult these lists and get someone off of these lists to come and work for you. And again, quite literally, they state on the podcast, yes, I have this list. Come and see me, contact me if you wish to hire people. I think at one point, Kelly Sue DeConnick even had on her personal website a link to where you could at the very least order this list from her. And this is not now. I mean, yes, they still have them now, I'm sure. But this is 3-4 years ago that they were talking about these lists. And why? Well, because as I did videos on them 5 to 6 years ago, the way that these companies would typically hire people was according to a curated list so that, in my estimation, they couldn't be sued for discrimination. Why? Because yes, they were discriminating, but they wouldn't open up the hiring practice to anybody so that anybody could get in. Again, because then you would have, people of merit and people who would have actual various tones of skin color applying, and you'd have to say no based upon their skin color, based upon their political beliefs, based upon their work ethic, etc., which is to say a good work ethic. But anyway, in order to sidestep that, they would, just as Sana Amanat was hired by getting tapped on the shoulder and say, hey, come and work for us, and she had no clue about any of it, so they would do the same for other people. So they would talk about it over and over again. The people who were hired by Marvel would say, how did you get hired by Marvel? And they would relate a story of, I was sitting there doing nothing in my comic shop or in my library because I didn't have a job, and someone called me or sent me an email from Marvel out of the blue saying, how'd you like to come and work for us? How does this system work? It works because they were put on a white list. And so they could use that white list as a pool of approved people to choose from in order to sidestep the whole, we're going to get sued because we're actually discriminating in our hiring practices. So, the point being, this system of nepotism has been in place for, at the very least, 5 or 6 years now. And previously, it was used in good times so that when things were expanding, you could choose from these lists in order to hire new people. Now they're going to be used, and again, we can see this through social media posts, and it's simply social media posts to this point because all of this happened less than a week ago. But they're going to be using these white lists to now draw on whenever they need a position filled. So yes, you're going to get these heavy ideologues just re-entered into the system again. And since there's going to be even less people working there, they're going to have more control. And again, this is not just speculation on my part. Go back to the video I did about that Writers Guild of America Association Zoom call where they talked about queering legacy characters and what they needed to do in order to do that. One of the people specifically explained on that Zoom call that they needed to get themselves, their foot in the door, into these companies and then take over more and more of the control from the people who are, as they would say, cis white males, elbow them out and then hire in people of their own quote-unquote progressive like in order to change the entire system. Which again, go right back to Sana Amanat. That's what she was hired to do, to change the entire system. So none of this is a big shocker to me. All right, so that's me being the dark cloud, telling everyone that you're looking at these mass firings of people and thinking this is going to right the ship. No, it's not going to do that whatsoever. But at the very least, there is a silver lining to this dark cloud, and it is as follows. Well, before I get into the silver lining, I guess I have to go even further into this dark cloud. Let's do that for just a second. The other mistaken idea that most people have right now is the fact that we're headed into or already are within and going to get deeper into heavy economic hard times. Which means these people are going to be fired, which means people of merit who make money are actually going to come back in, and we're going to get good systems of entertainment and other production. It's just going to right the ship. No. If you look historically at what happened last time, which was just in 2007 to 2009, that did not happen at that point. And so you can project that into the present slash future and say it's not going to happen this time either. Why do I say this? Well, because the economic hard times that we're in right now is because we're in a recession. The White House can redefine the word recession all they want. It's not going to change the fact that we are already, at the very least for the last 6 months, in a recession. So what we need to do is look at the last time there was a recession and see what these people did and what changes we have now. And if you don't remember, or you're too young to remember, the last recession was called the Great Recession, and it was between 2007 and 2009. And as someone who dealt with property back at that time, on the legalistic side, I may be a bit biased, but really the reason why that whole recession came about was because within the US, in the years leading up to 2007, there was what we would now call an extension of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the banking system, wherein they were saying that, look, you're denying all of these people who don't have enough money to pay back a mortgage. You're denying them mortgages. Why? Well, it appears because of isms of one kind or another, because they seem to be people of certain skin tones. You can't do that. You have to stop doing that. Therefore, give these people mortgages, even though they can't pay it back. And that's what they did for years and years before 2007. And what happened in 2007? Well, all of these mortgages started to come due, and these people, shocker, could not pay back their mortgages. Everybody started defaulting on their mortgages in these areas where they couldn't pay for them to begin with. That caused a housing crisis, which caused the economy of the United States to falter, which caused an entire global recession. Why? Because these banks didn't want to be called ists and phobes of one kind or another by denying mortgages to people that they knew couldn't pay them back. But here's my point. My point is that this quote-unquote progressive push is what caused the last recession to begin with. And if you're a rational person, you would think that since it is what caused the entire economic hard times, which we call the Great Recession, people might look at it in the economic sphere and say, yeah, perhaps we should move away from that. But they did the exact opposite. Why? Because quote-unquote progressivism is all about, it's never my fault, it's someone else's fault. Never look in the mirror for change, look for someone else to change because it's their fault, not mine. And the harder things get, the more they're going to scapegoat other people. That's what they did back in 2007 to 2009. That's what they're going to do with this recession that we're currently in. And again, to give you an example of what I just even talked about, that person that became the second in command at Marvel Comics, Sana Amanat, when was she hired? She was hired in 2009. Why? Because you had the comic companies who were faltering before 2007, and then the recession hit, and they faltered even more, and they said to themselves, well, how can we gain back the money and influence that we once had? I know, let's dive headfirst into what we now call diversity, equity, and inclusion, and hire someone who doesn't have the qualifications to do this, but to change the entire way that comics are made and the entire fan base, which is exactly, once again, the words of Sana Amanat herself. And oh, by the way, where did she come from? She wanted to originally be a journalist. And again, how did I start off this entire video? Well, it was the laying off of so many journalists. It's not that these people are going to have any kind of self-reflection and say, perhaps I was doing things wrong. Perhaps in order to actually feed myself, I need to think of a better way to do what I do for a living. No, they're going to point fingers at the scapegoat that they find handy and say it's their fault. We're going to leverage that in order to gain even more control over these systems. But the silver lining lies in what we now have within this recession that we did not have within the last, and that is a parallel economy. I am part of this parallel economy, and it has been building for, at the very least, the last 5 or 6 years. So it's still in its infancy, to be sure, but a recession is the kind of situation where it is a trial by fire. Those people who can't hack it need to die off. And those systems, especially within this parallel system, this parallel economy, who are basing their ideas upon merit, they're going to go super merit with everything they have in order to hang on in these hard times. Instead of growing little by little until we get to a point where our system will rival that of the other current systems that operate, say, within entertainment or news media or anything else, it's like we're Spartan children who are given a cloak and thrown out into the wilderness at 6 years old and said, take care of yourself. If you live through this, then you have the right to be a citizen. That's what's happening within this recession right now and within the parallel economy. And again, why am I talking about this? Someone who concentrates on the idea of a traditional hero? Well, because if we're looking at entertainment systems, these people who are building this parallel economy need to build the firmest foundation that they possibly can in order to stay alive within these economic hard times. And I would say, if you're part of an entertainment system, the easiest thing to use is a good story. Because what we have right now is the parallel economy with survival of the fittest and the legacy economy, especially within the entertainment system, being survival of the fattest. Quite literally, economists are looking at what is going on and applying it to these entertainment companies, and they're saying the ones that are small are probably going to die. They're probably going to be chopped up and sold for pieces. And when I say small, I'm talking about companies like Paramount, which is worth only $9 billion. They're considering that small fries, and they're going to falter and die or be chopped up and sold off as parts, or some rich benefactor is going to come in and buy the entire thing. That's what they consider a small company. But large companies like Disney, who is worth something north of $230 billion, well, they're going to be fine. They're going to cut down on many of the things that they've done, but they're fat enough so that they can survive these hard economic times. And once again, just going back to those statements about Bob Iger from Bob Iger I've covered over the last couple of weeks, where he's talking about what Marvel, Pixar, Star Wars as a part of Disney and Disney as a whole are going to do within the near future. What is he talking about? What is he doing? He's basically being two-faced, saying one thing to the shareholders and another thing to the people who are the consumers of the product, trying to lie to each side in order to come out on top. And he's looking into innovations, as he calls them, stuff like new ways of printing, new ways of telling stories according to greater CGI use. Now, I don't mean heavier CGI use. I mean using it as a story element itself, or looking at new ways of animation. But you see, all of these things he's looking into cost money. And they can do that because, again, survival of the fattest. But they all cost money. But if you're looking at the parallel economy and people who are going to survive through this, no, it's survival of the fittest. It's let's look at the most basic thing we can use, which, by the way, won't cost us any money, and use that and exploit that to the best of our ability in order to stay alive. And what is that thing that's not going to cost you any money if you concentrate on using superior forms of it for your product? Well, that is a good story. And part and parcel of a good story is a good traditional hero. That's why Aristotle, over 2,000 years ago, talked about in the logical form what is a good story. And part of that, he said, was a true traditional hero. Why? Because he says there is a fixed human nature. That fixed human nature is one that is centered around ideas of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so we are attracted to ideas of the true and the good and the beautiful. And when you construct a story and you have characters, you're going to automatically, according to your nature, yes, I know some people fight against their nature and say, I don't do that. Well, you're fighting against your nature if you don't do this. But normal people, the general rule for every normal human being is that when they see someone who is an exemplar of the true, the good, and the beautiful, they are attracted to them. And when they see people who are an exemplar of the opposite of all of that, well, they are repelled by such characters, and you label such characters a paragon of virtue, which is your hero, or a paragon of vice, which is your villain. So, one of the cornerstones of the entertainment system that is growing within the parallel economy needs to be the traditional idea of a hero. That is to say, this cornerstone being part and parcel of the firm foundation of good storytelling. Why? Because it is what is appealing to the human nature of every individual in this world. And again, yes, you're going to get outliers here and there, and even groups of outliers here and there that don't think in this way, but it doesn't matter. The majority of people instinctually think in this way. Therefore, leverage that to tell a good story, which is something you can do for free and build a absolutely secure foundation upon which you are building your entertainment system or your entertainment company. While Survival of the Fattest over at Disney are doing the exact opposite. They're continuing to exhaust their resources, even though they have been cut down severely. They're exhausting those resources to find new and innovative ways in order to make a spectacle. And so, again, what is this silver lining? Well, this silver lining is the fact that when this recession is finally over and people are looking at what kinds of companies they're finally going to spend their money on now that they have some disposable income, and it's going to be survival of the fittest versus survival of the fattest, who do you think they're going to choose? Well, my money's on the parallel economy companies who have dug down into themselves, who have used that to lay a firm foundation of good storytelling through uses of things like a traditional hero, who have, as the line goes, forged themselves in the furnace of their will to become a lean, mean storytelling machine. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment to tell me what you think about this entire thing. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels, stories that focus on the traditional idea of a hero and their traditional way of making a story. And if they sound or look appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.